Well, thank you for staying tuned. Now, like many other nations, Nigeria faces its fair share of burning economic and developmental issues that demand urgent attention and action. At the core of these challenges is the quest for sustained economic growth and development. Despite being the largest economy on the continent, Nigeria grapples with deep-seated issues from forex scarcity, high interest rates, depletion in the oil revenue due to theft and vandalism. Yeah, what we just discussed earlier. These pressing economic issues and concerns often interconnect with developmental issues that impede the nation's progress. Well, let's understand this better. And I'm being joined again via Zoom by Mr. Viola Kwaga. He's a senior researcher and policy analyst with Budget Nigeria. It's good to see you. It's been a while. How are you?
Hi, Tolu. Great to be here. Thank you.
All right, then. Well, let's start with all of the reforms that we've seen in recent times. I know your books are full. You've been doing a lot of notes and taking note of all of these moves since President Bola Tinubu took charge. We've seen some very decisive moves that many would say around the business world. But in your thoughts, what are you thinking? What would happen considering these policy moves in the short, medium, and long term?
Thank you so much for that, Tolu. I think it's important for us to really look at where we are now. So, for instance, we have a headline inflation of around 26.72%. And, we all know that rural and urban inflation are much different. It's much higher in urban areas than it is in rural areas. Our total debt is around 87.37 trillion naira. That's FG and the states as well. And of course, the federal government's debt is higher for both internal and external. We have a GDP of 2.51%, which is higher than the previous quarter, but lower than the last year's position. So we are not growing fast enough. Oil production, fortunately, is much higher for the month of October. We're around 1.7 million barrels per day. It's the highest since January of 2023. We've had a very low month. I think around May we had about 1 million barrels, but it is still, not as high as the OPEC quota, which is about 1.8 million barrels per day. We have an interest rate of 18.75, and the next MPC meeting is just around the corner. We have a new central bank governor. It's likely that the rate may not be increased. But, I have comments about that I might go to a little later. Capital importation actually dropped in 2022, and this was much lower than it was in 2021. So, we'll see at the end of the year what capital importation was for the 2023 fiscal year. The money supply, that's M1 and M2, actually increased quite considerably from May. We had a huge jump from around 50-something trillion to around 65 trillion, I think, in August. And, that says a lot about inflation and related problems. Unemployment, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what methodology you use, has dropped to around, the single digits, but it still fell further, from around 5.3% in Q4, I beg your pardon, of 2022 to around 4.1 in Q1 2023. So the short and medium term projections, I think, are as follows. The federal government suspects or hopes that it would reach around 3.75% GDP growth. That's a very, very optimistic figure. And it would depend very largely on how it is able to implement its numerous reforms, around revenue collection, around modernizing and improving the technology of tax collection, around government reforms in the civil service, transiting all government employees to the IPP-IS system, improving the profile of the customs, and making it more of a facilitator of trade, than a revenue-generating agency, as it were. Looking at total debts, I do not see total debts decreasing in the short or medium term. On the contrary, it's most likely going to increase. In fact, by the federal government's own admission, there would likely be an increase, in total debt, seeing that we are going to collect around $3.5 billion from the World Bank. And I know that there are other loans in the pipeline. However, President Tinubu has said that, his administration will move away from deficit financing and move more towards equity financing. Hence, his several trips abroad, courting investors. 2024 is really going to be a make or break year, I think, for him, and will really set, the tone, for that. I see oil production improving because as at, if you can look at the month-on-month change of oil production output, even if you consider condensates and non-condensates together, there has been a significant improvement. If this government can improve on the security around the oil-producing areas, finalize that and ensure that it can improve, then I definitely will see, oil production doing much better, and by extension, revenue, for the government. Interest rates, like I said, I suspect that there will be either a hold, at 18.7% or a slight reduction, as the case may be. I know President Tinubu has said publicly that he does not think that increasing interest rates is helping the economy. And, while I have my reservations about the president actually making his monetary policy stance open, seeing as that should be the exclusive preserve of the central bank governor, he nonetheless has said that. And it is likely that Dr. Cardoso would follow, in line with that. Money supply, I strongly believe that it might actually increase, seeing that there is a closing of the gap between the official rates and the parallel market rates. We'll most likely see a lot of Naira in the markets. And of course, because of other reasons, that follow. But by and large, I see, mixed performance of the economy. GDP growth, I think I could put my money on a slight increase, at least for H2 2023.
Deep, I must say. You touched every aspect of, almost every aspect of Nigeria's economy, looking at projection. But let me ask you, we have a supplementary budget. Figures just pushed in, and it's been approved, about 2.17 trillion naira. But really, my question to you is, how worried are you with regards to debt servicing?
I'm extremely worried. The debt service as of July 2023 was around 8.25 trillion naira. And there's a high likelihood, it follows that, that debt service would increase, seeing that this government, I think in the short term, is still relying on deficit financing. Though it's going to move to equity financing, I suspect in Q1, or rather the entire 2024, to 2025, between now and then, there's still a focus on deficit financing, which will come mainly from borrowing. So debt service is most likely going to shoot past 9 to 10 trillion naira. I think what's really worrying is even the budget deficits. If you recall, as of early this year, our deficit based on the 2023 budget was around 11 trillion. But with this supplementary budget of 2.17 trillion, we're looking at 13.5 trillion naira deficit. And that is going to mean more of our revenues, 96, 97, 100, 101% of our revenues, which was budgeted to be around 10 trillion. And the Nigerian federal government is notorious, for not meeting its revenue targets. So we are going to see an over 100% use of revenue to service debt, as it were. And this really brings into perspective the political will and the leadership function of this new administration. There have been some moves by this government to improve, ease of doing business. PEBEC has been releasing its reports, and I recall the head of PEBEC was on your show some weeks ago, and she spoke, very extensively on reforms that they had implemented. As well, we're seeing government reforms themselves with the ministerial retreat, with the setting up of the policy coordination units, and of course, Hadiza Bala Usman, who is President Tinubu's enforcer in chief, if you call her that. I think that's a very, very welcome development. I think it depicts a high level of seriousness, but this has to be seen in the context of current government spending, and future government spending. For instance, if you look at the total budget size predicted for 2024, 2025, and 2026, the medium-term expenditure framework, in very real numbers, was showing that recurrent expenditure, that's, overhead and personnel, would jump from 8 trillion to around 10 trillion in 2024, but might go back to around 9 trillion for 2025 and 2026. Capital expenditure, however, would move from around 6 trillion to 7 trillion and remain, 7 trillion for the medium term. And what does that say for development of infrastructure? What does that say for reducing the cost of governance? There seems to be some contradictory signals, because on one hand, this administration wants to improve the wages of public sector workers, which to a very large extent is arguable and deserved. However, looking at the government's current deficits and the translation of government activity to efficiency of the entire system, can we really say that the government is efficient in carrying out its duties, in implementing government interventions and programs? That is a discussion, for public policy. But, just to answer your question in short, I am very concerned. I am very worried for the government's balance sheet at the end of the day, because our budget deficit has already increased to 13 trillion, and our debt servicing is going to exceed 9 to 10 trillion, even in the short term.
Getting more interesting. Fiscal responsibility is key here. Many are talking about how government can also manage resources at this time, block leakages, of course, maybe implement some of the recommendations that have been on before now. How does that come to you, talking about both from the state level and subnational, or the federal level and subnationals?
So the subnationals in the recent past were stimulated to a very large extent by the World Bank SIFTAS program. That's the State Fiscal Transparency and Accountability Program for Results. And there were several initiatives that states were encouraged to implement, ranging from having debt and procurement laws, to publishing their budgets, budget implementation reports, having a budget law that defines and guides the budget making process. Many states were able to buy in to this set of reforms. I guess there's a pun somewhere, because by doing so, they were earning, a foreign currency. But unfortunately, the SIFTAS program has come to an end. And what we've come to observe is many of those reforms that were implemented by the instrumentality of the World Bank program they're not really being continued entirely. So there's a challenge of whether states will be able to live up to the expectations created by their own performance in the World Bank SIFTAS program for results. So, for instance, because of our federal nature, states, to a very large extent, as defined by the Constitution, can make laws, for themselves. So fiscal responsibility is one of them. A number of states have fiscal responsibility commissions, and I recall reading a piece where the Fiscal Responsibility Commission was carrying out a training for a number of fiscal responsibility commissioners in the various states. But I am not completely sure if all 36 states do have, a fiscal responsibility commission. In a related note, the Treasury single account is another set of protocols that ensures that states can plug leakages in real time. This ranges from knowing how much money is coming in to knowing how much money is going out. And some states have gone very far. Kaduna State, for instance, under El Rufai, was so sophisticated that it had like a dashboard in the governor's office where he could see how much money was coming in. But is this the case for the rest of the states in the federation? It's hard to say. One would have to carry out a survey, to determine that. So by and large, again, the performance is somewhat mixed, but I think at least 70% of the Nigerian states are doing a bit better. Does this reflect in their reporting? That's another different conversation, because one thing about the Budget Foundation is we deal a lot in state data. And sometimes this data is published, and it is brought down after a matter of days, which is not very good. Going to a federal performance now, while the federal government has to a very large extent implemented the Treasury single account, from Buhari's first term, we are seeing some mixed performance in terms of things like government-owned enterprises revenue, because that forms a very large percentage of government expenditure and should form a larger percentage of government earnings. But the reverse tends to be seen, where the government is investing heavily in their capital expenditure, their overheads, and their personnel, and not really getting much in terms of income from these government-owned enterprises. As a matter of fact, the budget call circular for 2024, was very explicit in naming customs revenue and revenue from government-owned enterprises as having underperformed, pro rata, that's from January 2023 to around June or July when the circular was released. So, a lot more needs to be done in terms of the administration of government-owned enterprises. And, the Fiscal Responsibility Commission had spoken up several times in the past, which prompted the Buhari administration to come up with the 50% cost to revenue ratio, where for every 50 kobo if a government-owned enterprise makes 50 kobo, it should be, if a government-owned enterprise spends 50 kobo, it should be earning 1 naira. But we are yet to see a continuation and an implementation, by this administration in that regard. Again, the medium-term expenditure framework, was very clear in a series of interventions that aims to achieve in terms of balancing and managing the economy, to improve revenue. Looking at customs, for instance, there are explicit lines of action that speak to modernizing, customs as an agency of government that is efficient and effective, which also talks about technology base, which also talks about human capital development of the officers of the customs, the customs unit in facilitating trade as opposed to standing as a barrier. In addition, there's a move to align with the common ECOWAS tariff, among other things, with customs. There's also going to be some upward review on certain items like alcoholic beverages, which is to improve revenue from customs. And I know that for oil, for oil revenue, the government is spending a lot on security. The supplementary budget had several line items that were dedicated to security spending. And, the Office of the National Security Advisor has also been seen, on a couple of occasions, making actual visits to that area. So, there has been a lot of activity, but we really need to wait to see if there will be performance, for this rest of the last quarter and the beginning of the next quarter, and, of course, H1 2024. For tax revenue and reform, the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Reforms has been in the news a lot. Mr. Tayo Oyedele has been on your show several times, and it's always a pleasure to see him speak, on the several reforms. And I think as at the last time I checked, there are moves to drive down the number of taxes, to single digits. And this is supposed to even include the states. It's going to be a very tough call negotiating with the states. But if the federal government can demonstrate a level of transparency and, like the VAT regime, be the collector and distribute at the end of the day, barring the suit, currently in courts to challenge, the jurisdiction of the federal government to collect taxes, I think that can be something that can be negotiated, and the federal government, can continue in that line to collect taxes on behalf of the states and remit, as at when due. There are also moves in the pipeline to improve, tax collection, ranging from improving or appointing more VAT collectors to automating VAT collection to improving tax audits and investigation. These are some of the things that the government, has planned to do. I guess 2024 will be, like I said, that make or break year where a lot of the activity, a lot of the promises, a lot of the anticipation will finally, come to fruition. And we'll really see if Tinubu can put his money where his mouth is. For independent revenue, again, this speaks to the issue of the operating surpluses of GOEs, which the government intends to collect, with much more seriousness and much more efficiency. The budget call circular also, mandated GOEs to submit their revenue and expenditure projections for the next 3 years, as well as their 2024 budget estimates. So, civil society, Nigerians in the media, should please watch that, the budget office actually collects these documents and publishes them, makes them, accessible by the public. Of course, there are other interventions, in the industry area, in empowering youth, in providing inclusive growth that this government intends to improve. It's all there in the medium-term expenditure framework, in addition to much more focus on the assembly of cars and, the movements to a green economy, the creation or the disbursement of monies from the sovereign green bond, is another aspect of revenue that the government wants to create, for government agencies to ensure that there's more money available for them, for its own fiscal plans in the long term. And of course, enhancing fiscal transparency is another aspect that this government has laid out. It has laid out in, much detail in the medium-term expenditure framework as well, relating to the review of the costs and, revenues of agencies, improving the quality of the civil service itself. In the news, I read this morning that about 80 permanent secretaries wrote a test or an exam for promotion, and only 20 of them passed. I guess, even the head of service is also keen on being parts of Tinubu's agenda. And, I was also pleased to hear that the Federal Civil Service Commission, was reconstituted and a new chairman was appointed. And I think that's actually a very good signal that the civil service and, governance in general, has a good sign of improving in the coming quarter.
Interesting conversation. Viola Kwaga is a senior research and policy analyst with Budget Nigeria. Thank you so much. Always interesting having you on the program. We appreciate this.
Thank you for having me, Tolu.